Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and part 2 of my ink and watercolour budgie painting. In part 1 I talked you through the ink painting techniques I used to paint the first of the 3 budgies, and today in part 2 I'm going to be using my watercolours to paint the background as well as the branch the budgies are perched on, so I hope you enjoy the video. As always, all the art supplies I'm using in today's tutorial will be listed in the description box, as well as the reference picture I used from Pixabay. If you haven't seen part 1 of this painting, I'll also link that at the end of this video. I was aiming for a fairly loose and bright background today using a limited palette and mix these colours with water before painting. I'm going to start with the background first and the wet in wet technique, so I pre-wet my paper with clean water in a spray bottle. I then use a flat brush to spread the water evenly over the surface of the paper. Using the spray bottle and a flat brush really helps you get an even layer of water down quickly, and being that I use permanent ink to paint the budgies in, I haven't got to worry about any water reactivating or upsetting it. Still using my flat brush, I then start to drop in some of the May green onto the wet paper. This wet in wet technique means by adding wet paint onto wet paper that the colour can bleed out without any harsh edges forming. Whilst the paper is still wet, I also add in some sap green and start to indicate some loose leaf shapes with my brush. As I work across the page, I still try to leave some of the white of the paper showing, especially above the third budgie, as I want to keep it light and bright here. Now, still working wet into wet, I add in a darker green. This one is permanent green olive. I let it bleed together with the other greens on the paper. And I continue to add in more leafy shapes like this and try to work fairly quickly before the paper dries. You can see the effect of the paper starting to dry as I'm painting in the bottom right hand corner, and you get a few more defined edges, but being that this is just the first layer, I'm not too worried. Now it's time to move on to the first layer of the branch. For this, I'm again using the wet in wet technique and still using my flat brush, pre-wet the whole of that branch area with clean water. I then drop in a light coating of burnt umber. I start at the top of the branch and let that paint just bleed into the water. I'd made sure the background was completely dry before adding water to the branch. In this way, none of that brown paint would bleed out into the green paint. I'm also being careful to leave some of the white of the paper on the areas of highlight on the branch. And then again, whilst the paper is still wet, I can go in with a more concentrated burnt umber, just to darken up those values. The paper is still wet at this point, so I can use my flat brush to move that pigment about a bit and not leave any harsh edges. I add more burnt umber, this time from the underside of the branch, and let it bleed upwards, before then lifting any highlights off with a paper towel. Whilst that branch is drying, I then go on to move on the second branch using the same technique. So I pre-wet the area with clean water and then drop in the paint. This branch is slightly more green in colour, so I add some sap green to my burnt umber and drop it in much as before. I soften out any edges that are forming with a clean damp brush, before putting in some more burnt umber to the underside of this branch. The area on the top of this branch was in highlight, so it was important again to leave the white of the paper here. With the top branch now dry, it was time to add in a second layer, and for this I repeated the process as before. So I dampened the branch first with clean water and then dropped in some more concentrated paint. For this, I switched from my flat brush to a size 8 round brush, as I wanted to start building in a few more details, and this makes the paint easier to control. I mixed some sepia into the burnt umber to get a really nice dark brown colour, and applied this first to the top of the wet branch, working more carefully around the budgie's feet and those highlight areas. Then I added the same paint mix on the bottom half of the branch, allowing the colour to spread out over the wet paper. By this stage I started to think about adding texture, so I wasn't too worried about leaving any gaps in the paint. What I was concerned about though was getting this branch dark enough, as I wanted to get a good contrast between the light bright background and the branch itself, which is the darkest part of this painting. So I added another layer of darker, more concentrated paint onto the wet paper to build up the value some more. I made sure to add really crisp, clean edges on the bottom and top of the branch to really help it stand out from the background. I also started to add the beginnings of some texture to that branch just by adding some brush strokes. And then whilst that was drying, it was time to work on the other branch. This branch was slightly out of focus in my reference picture, but still needed to be a lot darker. So I went in with a more concentrated burnt umber straight away for this layer and added in some sap green just at the top of the branch where the light was catching it. I softened any edges with a clean damp brush and lifted off any excess paint and water with a paper towel. Now I'm going to add in some texture to that main branch, and for this I'm using the dry brush technique. So I load up my brush with paint and remove any excess liquid onto a paper towel. Then using the side of my brush I sweep it across the surface of the paper, and because the brush is dry you get gaps in the paint, which gives you a nice textured effect. It's a good idea to add some variation to your brush stroke so it doesn't look too uniform and unnatural, and I try to use my reference photo as a guide for any pattern or direction in the bark. I find this a really easy way to add some interesting effects to surfaces that ordinarily may be a bit challenging. You can also switch up to using the tip of your brush rather than the side for individual features in the bark. Now I'm also using the lifting technique just to lighten up a few areas, which just adds in a bit more variation. I make sure the surface of my paper is completely dry for this and just go in with a clean damp brush and slightly rub it onto the branch before lifting up any excess paint with a paper towel. With the branch in the foreground a lot darker now, I need to go in and make the branch in the background slightly darker too. So I just go in and add a darker wash of the burnt umber. Again softening any edges with a clean damp brush. With the branches done, I focus my attention back onto the foliage in the background. I wasn't aiming for super detailed here, as I mainly wanted to keep the focus on the budgies and keeping the piece light and bright, but I did want to add in a few leafy shapes and a variety of values and hues. So I re-wet the background area again and began to add another layer of leaves, this time starting with a more concentrated mix of permanent green olive and mixing in some more sap green onto the wet paper. In the first layer I was concentrating mainly on colour and areas of light and dark. In this layer though I built up more colour but also was a bit more intentional with my leaf shapes. I also like to use a bit of negative painting to paint around the areas I want to keep light, like I'm doing here. I continued to add in leafy shapes, working in layers to try and build depth in the foliage, but this was the hardest part of the painting for me. I didn't want to add in a lot of detail to individual leaves with the veins and so on, but I wanted the foliage to look quite thick while still maintaining the lovely lighting that had made this reference photo so appealing. I find it quite a hard balance to get, and whilst there are parts of the background I like, there are also parts that I'm not so happy with, perhaps falling into the category of being neither loose nor detailed, so it's an area I still need to practice on. Here I decided to go in and add some individual leaves around the outside edges of the painting to help break up the space on the left hand side and to help direct your eye into the centre. And whilst I quite like these finer fronds, I'm not sure whether I should have stopped sooner or at the very least taken a break and looked at it with fresh eyes. I am really pleased with how the budgies turned out though, and I had a lot of fun creating the texture and depth for the branch. I also like how the light shines through onto the third budgie's chest, so the last thing I did was to use a damp angled brush to just lift up a few more light spots. But with that, this painting was done, and the only thing left to do was to enjoy peeling off the washi tape. So let me know what you think in the comments box below, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel if you're new around here. Hit the bell icon too if you'd like to be notified every time I upload a new video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll put a link above to part 1 of this painting if you want to go and check that out, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care and have a great weekend. Bye!